Hey, John Gilroy here. We're going to dive into a real important topic, API security for the federal government. Hit the music, Manny. Welcome to the Federal Tech Podcast, the podcast that connects you to federal technology leaders. My name is John Gilroy, and I will be your moderator in the virtual studio. Today is Brian Dennis, Principal Technologist, Public Sector at a company called Akamai, Akamai. And Brian, I went to Google Trends. I typed in API security. Boom, hockey stick. It's like if you type in, I guess, March Madness, you see the same kind of thing. March Madness, API security. This is the hottest thing in town, isn't it?
Absolutely. We're seeing such a growth in APIs these days. It's been around for a long time. However, we're seeing not just the growth in APIs, but also the interest from the cyber threats that are out there in the world. When you talk about that hockey stick of growth, so much of the internet is now based in the concept of APIs, but also the attackers are coming for them. And so we know that there's been a 1,200% increase in API attacks over the last several years, and that's only going to get worse in the near future.
Yeah, it's like I'm trying to break into Brian's house, and the front windows are locked, and the back windows are locked, and the front door is locked, but the garage, I'm going through the garage. Brian never thought of locking the garage door, and so I think this is what's going on in the federal government. They're knocking on this door, knocking on that door, and people are neglecting protecting your APIs because it's not any checklist that I know. It's not one of the pillars for zero trust, but it works with zero trust. It works with so many of these concepts that are important for the federal government. Real important for the federal government is resilience. So let's start off talk about Akamai and resilience for my Govy listeners.
Yeah, and so resilience is really the backbone of everything that we do. And so Akamai has been around for 25 years. And a lot of us know Akamai as a content delivery network. But what we really are doing these days is focus on security. We see about 33% of the world's internet traffic every day because of our large network on the edge. And that gives us the ability to understand where these threats are coming from and what we can do to make sure that people are building back and bouncing back as quickly as possible after an attack. We know that attacks are going to come. It's not a question of if you're attacked, it's a question of when. And how do you respond, and where does that resilience come into play within your planning?
Brian, I've known about Akamai for a long time, and what I see is these trends in the business over the years. 10, 15 years ago was a trend towards the cloud, and then the last 5 or 6 years, I see the trend towards edge and edge computing, and people, let's take and compute at the edge. It'll be faster. They're computing at the edge in space now. They're doing geosynchronous orbit, and they're looking at geography and computing up there. And all of a sudden, Akamai's been sitting at the edge for 20. Hey, we've been here for 20 years. You're finally coming to the party. But that's your skill set is at the edge, isn't it?
It really is. And it's allowed us to become really that go-to provider for all of these folks now who aren't just building networks based on one simple concept. Everybody's, they've got hybrid networks where they've got cloud, they've got on-prem. They're mixing and mashing so much together. And Akamai is able to provide that security at that edge, at that closest point. So we provide the detailed service that they need to keep themselves up and running, no matter what factors are coming in.
When you talk to Govies, you talk about zero trust these days. That's top of mind for most people. So where do you fit in with the discussion of zero trust and segmentation, microsegmentation? Is that part of your skill set as well?
Absolutely. And so zero trust it's one of those concepts and phrases that gets tossed around a lot. I know that we have so many organizations that are trying to build, these perfect roadmaps to what zero trust should be, but there isn't one. For every organization, that zero trust journey is going to be different, and it's going to require different sets of skills. And so Akamai is looking at that and figuring out how we can best approach that problem. And microsegmentation is a great way to start. So segmentation of old was clunky, and it took years to get implemented, and really more often than not, it became shelfware. And so what microsegmentation does, it's really going all the way down to that agent level space within the network and allowing a network administrator for the first time to gain this visibility into their network that they might not have ever seen before. And then from that point, being able to ring fence off, basically segment off the most important pieces of information in the crown jewels of the network so that no attacks can come in and potentially move laterally through your network to take over.
Now, visibility is really the hot topic. Now, let's say 15 years ago, I get hired And then Brian would say, get this little clipboard, John, and go down to the server room and write down all the servers. Okay. So 10 years ago, you'd say, okay, we've got a tool here. We're going to find out where all the nodes are in this network. We're going to have all the IP addresses. It'd be great. We know everything. Now today, Brian says, well, that's table stakes. We got to now inventory the APIs. Now we're not. This is almost like a virtual inventory. I mean, there are APIs that pop up. You know, and I know that there are scoundrels out there that start using APIs without any permission. They would rather ask for forgiveness than permission. So pop up shadow. So how do you even discover? How do you get the visibility into APIs?
Absolutely. That's a great problem, a great question. And we're seeing this happen more and more, where we're speaking to organizations where they're thinking, oh, we've got let's just say 500 active APIs. I know we have 500 active APIs. And so what we will do is we will launch into their system to really begin inventorying and, basically building an asset control of those APIs within their system. And come to find out, on average, we're seeing about 40 to 50% more APIs than they actually expected to have. And the reason that that's happening is so many organizations are building APIs where development teams might not necessarily be speaking to network teams. There's just not enough communication that's going on. Or an API might have been built 10 years ago and nobody's been using it ever since. And so it's kind of hanging out there in the background, and this ghost or shadow API is what we like to call them, where it's still accessible. There's still a probability of somebody getting in there. And that's that great garage door reference that you were talking about earlier, where the attackers can find that sneaky way in that you just forgot to lock. And the next thing you know, they're in your network.
And this isn't intentional. This isn't John Gilroy gets up and plans to overthrow No, an easy way to do it. In fact, you can get dormant APIs that John written 10 years ago. You can get, going to have undocumented APIs, and it could be outside the gateway. So they're in places. What's the thing in tennis? Hit them where they're not. I mean, the APIs may be in places that maybe surprise you. You report to a federal, you go, well, we didn't know it was, I didn't know it was either. And so but no one thinks to look there.
Absolutely. And for many years, most cyber attacks were really built on the concept of potentially, actually hacking into a network and doing the work and doing the technology, utilizing the technology it took to get you in there. Or they were going the easy route and they were utilizing phishing. And phishing techniques were, throwing an email up and saying, hey, it's March Madness time. Here, click this link to pick your bracket. The next thing you know, your entire network's taken over. But now that we have all of these APIs that are out there potentially offering, the keys to the kingdom without any real work that the attackers have to do, because they're utilizing AI, they're utilizing new technologies just as quickly as we are. So we have to begin understanding where potentially those APIs are existing and what we can do to either shut them down or make sure that they aren't connected to anything within our systems.
Most of my listeners know what an ATO is, and you get a system that gets authority to operate, so it's fine and dandy. But you could have shadow API that is not part of the ATO process, and that can result in what some people call invisible entry points. Well, what do you mean? Well, they're there, but they're not documented. They're somewhere, and that can... if you're worried about, I guess a lawn mowing service in Illinois, well, who cares? But if you're worried about the Pentagon, all of a sudden, invisible entry points can be vulnerability points, can't they?
Absolutely. Prior to joining Akamai, I spent many years working for universities. And I always loved working with universities and working with students. And the students in their labs were always building things and, seeing if they could build a new API. I fear what's going on in the university world right now. Because I guarantee you, a lot of students, potentially not meaning to do any harm, are building APIs and launching them without even anyone within the network or within the university knowing that. And the same thing is happening in government, where they're trying to do something good. They're trying to do something that's going to make things better, utilizing the API to make a process easier, but potentially dropping that project and not necessarily thinking about it anymore. And in 5 years down the road, it's still there. It's not visible in the network, but that's the door they're using to get in.
So I'm looking at, identification, visibility, fine. But let's go back to the beginning of this conversation with microsegmentation. It could very well be that if a system is microsegmented, all of a sudden that area where the shadow IT is lurking it's segmented off. So, hey, all of a sudden, problem solved. Now, that is one approach to resolving this, isn't it?
Absolutely. And that visibility within microsegmentation gives you the understanding of where lines of communication are happening. And so if we can understand, if this port is connecting to the internet through this port, we can cut that line of communication off, especially if we're looking at this map of this visibility map that we've never really seen before of our network and questioning, what is that? And why is this even on my network? And so it gives you that ability to understand where the communication is happening and stopping any type of threat from coming through. Microsegmentation offers that ability to basically stop the fire before it starts. And that's kind of what we're thinking of when we're pushing people to do it.
Is that what your Guardicore is? I mean, you absorbed that company last year, right? Is that what the offering is?
Absolutely. And so Guardicore, Akamai and Guardicore came together in 2021, actually, so several years now. Mm-hmm. And it's been a really great partnership in bringing Guardicore on board because this is the top tier. It really does allow organizations for the first time ever to see what's going on within their network. And it also offers almost a second set of hands and eyes, which for a lot of federal organizations is very important. The labor pool in cybersecurity is stretched thin. We have almost 1 million open jobs in cyber across the US, and we're not filling them quick enough. But when I was working in the university world, I know that we were building cyber programs as quickly as we could. We still have a ton of people to train and get them the understanding to be able to do this work. And so microsegmentation can help a lot of network administrators sleep at night because they're no longer having to sit there 24 hours a day seeing where lines of communication are coming and potentially where those threats are coming in.
Okay, Brian Dennis can't sleep at night, picks up his phone, looks at the news. We get to see ransomware stories. We kind of, we know about ransomware stories, but we don't see any stories on API vulnerabilities and API attacks. So give me give me a use case or an example of, so how are they using an API to go after a system? Give me a for instance.
So, that API is kind of like the waiter at a restaurant. And so the customer comes in, the customer is that user, and the customer comes in, sits at a table, and then the kitchen is in the back waiting to get the order. And that's what the API is. And the API is that person in the middle getting that information. And so within a government organization, you can think of where a government entity might be signing up people who want to receive tax credits or discounts for EV vehicles that they've bought through organizations. And that's a great, for instance, they're collecting a lot of data, a lot of information, a lot of that tax identifications, Social Security, all of that information is getting poured into the API, which is then hopefully pushing that back to production, to the kitchen in this instance. But if we have an attacker who's able to grab hold of that API and basically reroute that information, so the user comes in, sits down, gives all the information to the API, and then that information and data gets kicked back to the attacker who knows where they are and what they're doing with that data, and then allowing them to go further into the network because they can see those lines of communication and how they're working.
So that can apply to many different areas of the federal government where people are going online to apply for something, or
Absolutely.
If they're going on to get information. I mean, there's a big move on citizen experience and websites, and we want that citizen experience to be just like Sweetgreens. So you go to Sweetgreens and you order your salad, and I want to go and order my FEMA forms, and maybe the emphasis on CUCI, on customer experience, may open up unintended consequences for vulnerabilities there. Oh, yeah, we'll just use this. Oh, we use it at Sweetgreens. No one's going to go after Sweetgreens, but talk about Department of Defense, Department of War, that's the opportunity. All of a sudden, but we want to make it commercial. Commercial's fine, but, we have to talk to Akamai first before we do just like Amazon, huh?
Yep, absolutely. And those attacks, the attackers are casting a wide net. And so they're not necessarily waking up in the morning saying, okay, I'm going to spend my entire day going after the U.S. Department of Defense, Department of War. What they're doing is they're throwing out that net. Now they're utilizing AI to understand, where they can really cast the widest net and hit the most people all at once. And so, that's what they're building is this cohesive network of attacks. And they're doing it throughout the government, not just the U.S. government, state government, local government. My 13-year-old niece, her school system just recently went through a ransomware attack. So they're going after everybody they can go for right now.
I was in downtown D.C. just yesterday, and you drive around these big old buildings, been around forever, and and I know there's applications in there that have been around forever. and in town who we call them legacy applications. And the reason they're there is because they're resilient and reliable and they seem to work. However, people realize it's going to be much less expensive to move to perhaps a cloud-based system. And so how can you help my govies who are trying to update legacy system and still at the same time, Brian, you gotta cut the grass and make dinner. So you have to upgrade the legacy system while still maintaining security and compliance. So can your edge skills maybe assist in that endeavor?
Absolutely. And so when we think about legacy systems these days, that's where microsegmentation really comes into play.
That's it.
We have a lot of legacy systems out there, and I can think of a great example of this is hospitals. Hospitals utilize MRI machines, utilize X-ray technology, and a lot of it is pretty dated. It hasn't been updated, and they're still using very old operating systems to get this done. And so you have to be able to protect those legacy systems and to make sure that they're fenced off so that no security threats can get in to potentially corrupt it. And we have the same issues within government. Within government, there's a lot of older systems that just haven't been updated, or the cost to update them is very prohibitive. And so thinking about like electric grids, water resources, a lot of the technology that was built specifically for these endeavors, and we haven't been able to update them yet, or it's just too expensive. And so microsegmentation can come in and really wrap that 10-foot barbed wire fence around those pieces so that nobody can get in.
10 years ago, I sat down with the CEO of Maximus, and that's when I learned the word microsegmentation. And when I first heard it, I was thinking, well, if you got nothing else to do on a Friday afternoon, Brian, why don't you work on the microsegmentation? I mean, it can't hurt. But then when I think about the discussion we just had 2 minutes ago, so we have a legacy system. It's possible you can isolate that system and then work on the front end and improve that front end while that system is isolated. And that's not done that's done through years of dedicated people understanding the segmentations and applying those microsegmentations. Is like, well, I love artificial intelligence and robots, and let's talk about Elon Musk, but maybe it's people working 40 hours a week, understanding systems, segmenting them properly that'll allow this transition, but that's not very glamorous. Microsegmentation, you're not going to get 200 people in a room at the convention center. Hey, John Gilroy talking about microsegmentation. Not glorious, is it?
It's not. And it definitely has, unfortunately, it has a bad reputation because segmentation of old, it rarely worked perfectly.
Yeah.
So microsegmentation, you can have these legacy systems that create these problems, and you can basically build that fence around them. And the entire time you're doing this, you're not going offline. And so segmentation of old, you were having downtime potentially months. With microsegmentation, Akamai focuses microsegmentation on the concept of, okay, what can we do today to make sure that an organization gets safe? First thing let's do is let's build a visibility map. And then let's start, segmenting off this network. Potentially, we can have a segmentation project done in about 6 weeks' time. Where segmentation of old, we were talking 2 years, 2.5.
That's what everyone remembers. That's what I remember.
So, what we do now is we're thinking in the matter of weeks. And especially, unfortunately, there's been a trend over the years that the CIO position, the CISO position, it's kind of a movable position. You see a lot of organizations where a CISO might be in that position for a year or two because there's the constant trend in cybersecurity to move up and up and up. And so CISOs or CIOs would start segmentation projects back 20 years ago and never finish them. That can be the feather in your cap. You can come in and say, this organization prior to my entrance was a flat network, potentially had major threats all over the place. And within 6 weeks, we were able to turn that around and make them as safe as anything on the planet.
I walked into that trap because that was my mental construct, is we'll get a team of people. And since I was taking 4 to 6 months of hard work, but it kind of shows you how I'm locked into that, 4 or 5 year. I mean, that was the standard methodology for decades.
Yeah, and because of the way that we do it, utilizing agents, it's done behind the scenes. And so a lot of it's done utilizing machine learning, giving you the ability to really, you at the human level, begin thinking about policies and procedures. Akamai has templatized a lot of that, but you can create your own and make it easy. But at the same time, you're never having to shut down your network. You're never having to take anything out of production. it's all just running smoothly behind the scenes.
Okay, Brian, I did my homework this morning. I'm scratching my head, and all my 3 brain cells, I'm trying to figure this out. And I'm going to jump back to this visibility of APIs. Okay, so you look every nook and cranny for an API. When I went to your website, with Akamai.com, I'll put in the show notes, it talked about scanning code repositories for API vulnerabilities. And I said, what? is every nook and cranny? I mean, because coders today, they just pull it off the shelf, pop it in. So what you're telling me is you have the ability to say, now, wait, we're going to take a look at that stuff there, Ralph, before you plug it into the system. You actually can look at code repository and look for that's the next level.
Yeah, and that's where we brought on No Name last year. No Name is really the engine behind our API security, and that's the ability that they have and bringing to Akamai is giving us the ability to look at that code level within those APIs to understand where that vulnerability lies, and if you're going to put something out in production, to make sure that it's safe to go.
And that's, I think, the word. I was reading an article about you guys this morning. I guess the word is operationalize. Is that the term that's used? Because all of a sudden, you're not just a tool. You're part of a system, and you can go from, and here's the phrase that pays, from code to runtime. Yeah. That's the stretch.
Yeah, it really is. And that's why we like to think of ourselves as partners. And so we're not, it's not just you're buying a service and then we're just walking away and you're done. With Akamai, our focus is to make sure that the ability and that craftsmanship that comes into building these APIs, you're putting them out the best product available, and utilizing us as that partner to make sure that they're polished and dusted off and as show floor ready when they're put out there.
Yeah, it's also an ability to classify an API, and you can maybe. The term risk management. I never thought of risk management for APIs. I guess that's going to be an article you can write now. Risk management for APIs, because there's some you may want to be concerned with and some that you may not want to be concerned with, and do it for a rainy day, huh?
Absolutely. There is so much potential risk that's laying out there in APIs right now, where there's data that's being collected, very sensitive data for some people, and we've got to make sure that that's going to be kept as secure as possible. And at the same time, not opening up any other entryways for attackers to get into our networks.
I talked about API security at the top of the show here. And it's just really, it's a whole new world that I think people are just going to explore. And when they go to Google and type in API security, you're going to find what I did is Akamai is right in the top, because and you've been at this leading edge for a while now. So you have a lot of understanding of just the terminology involved, like a shadow API. I'm sure that's going to be associated with you more than any other company.
Yeah, I think so. And, API, the attacks against APIs, it really is, we're just in the infancy of it. I have a fear that this is going to be something that's going to be massive and major over the next several years. And it's time now to start planning for what to do.
Wow. Well, I think you've given our listeners a real good idea of how to manage API attacks for federal systems. We're running out of time here, Brian. You have been listening to the Federal Tech Podcast with John Gilroy. I'd like to thank my guest, Brian Dennis, Principal Technologist, Public Sector at Akamai. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you, John.